So welcome, welcome. It's nice to be here, practice together. So tonight I'd like to, I'm going to start with this little bit of a story that just recently I had this pain in my arm, and it would bother me when I just did certain movements, not other movements, but just particular ones. I had no idea how this happened. I don't have any memory of doing anything in particular, and it was kind of persistent, and I noticed that, of course, I just stopped doing certain movements because it was painful, right? And then slowly it got resolved. It resolved itself. So, right, a little bit of a mystery. But what's the interesting part is, for me it's interesting, is that I didn't notice immediately when it went away. Like often we don't notice. But then I did something and I had this memory like, oh yeah, I couldn't do this movement. And at that moment when I remembered, oh yeah, this used to hurt, it doesn't hurt anymore. There was this little bit of delight. Like, wow, that's great. Kind of recognizing the stories I had made about like, why don't I know what this is and what should I do about it? Like there's all these stories that accompanied this discomfort, this little pain that I was having. And I didn't notice, when I didn't notice it, it just went on and like things were back to normal, quote unquote. But when I did notice this sense of uplift, this sense of delight, this little bit of happiness. And so it just reminded me that actually this fleeting, flickering sense of uplift or delight is a part of our experience, but we often kind of ignore it or dismiss it because it's small, or it's just maybe it just affirms how we think things should be or something like this. But this can be a support for our practice. This recognition of when something that's been troubling or difficult has gone away, and that little bit of sense of relief when it's gone away can be a support. And the Buddha talked about this. There's even a little bit of a simile about this, or a story about this, and he says, suppose a person were sick, suffering and gravely ill. They'd lose their appetite and get physically weak. I think back then, thousands of years ago, medicine was a lot about just food and, what you did and didn't eat, and whether you were healthy or not is whether you had an appetite or not, right? We can imagine, right, that a couple of thousand years ago, their idea of medicine is different than what we have now. So suppose a person were sick, suffering, and gravely ill. They'd lose their appetite and get physically weak. But after some time, they'd recover from that illness and regain their appetite and their strength. And thinking about this, they'd be filled with joy and happiness. So thinking, remembering, bringing to mind, oh yeah, I used to be really sick. I'm not so sick right now. And just that feeling of, I'm using the word delight, but maybe it's gladness or something like this, happiness, joy, these types of words. And the Buddha talked about this experience of how it feels when difficulties end, and a few colorful stories, few colorful little vignettes. I'd like to share a few of them. For me, I kind of like to hear, it kind of like makes it a little more juicy and come alive to hear these, kind of like this being painted, little bit more evocative with some of the language here. So the Buddha says, suppose a person who has gotten into debt and then were to apply themselves to work and their efforts proved successful, that they would pay off their original loan and have enough left over to support their family. Thinking about this, they'd be filled with joy and happiness. So this feeling of debt and getting out of debt and even having to be able to support others, filled with joy and happiness. Suppose a person were imprisoned in a jail. But after some time, they were released from jail, safe and sound with no loss of wealth. So maybe they didn't get fined so much, or maybe people didn't steal everything while they were in jail, but they would be released from jail, safe and sound with no loss of wealth. And thinking about this, they'd be filled with joy and happiness. Suppose a person were a bond servant. They belonged to someone else or were unable to go where they wished. But after some time, they'd be freed from servitude and become their own master. An emancipated individual able to go wherever they wished. Thinking about this, they'd be filled with joy and happiness. Are there times in which we feel like we're the slaves to, I don't know, just sometimes these social media companies that set it up to, just click one more thing, or we feel like we're a slave to fashion, or what are these, all these types of things, right? That kind of we get pushed around a little bit. But then to notice when we're not pushed around, the ease that's available. Suppose there were a person with wealth and property who was traveling along a desert road. But after some time, they crossed over the desert, safe and sound, with no loss of wealth. Thinking about this, they'd be filled with joy and happiness. Sometimes we might have this idea, right, that it feels really barren and not a lot of support or things that might be nourishing, and we have to traverse this area, go on this journey. So the Buddha is listing all these occasions or these imaginations or these stories in which a person is experiencing difficulties. And they all get kind of expressed as not being able to go where you want to go or do what you want to do, or kind of this oppression or constriction or bondage or tightness of some sort. And then when that difficulty is resolved, they experience joy and happiness. So some of you might have recognized those stories. Those are the similes that are used for the hindrances, to describe the hindrances. That is, these 5 energies, these 5 habits, these 5 patterns that are part of human experience, part of everybody's human experience. When they arise, it is not a failing, it's not something we're doing wrong, it's just what it means to be a human, is to have some of these 5 patterns. The first one is sensual desire, but like clinging to sensual desire, grasping, craving for sensual desire. This idea that I'm not going to be happy until I have that double caramel, triple chocolate ice cream, or whatever it is. And it's surprising, right, how often we're kind of pushed around by just wanting the next pleasant experience. Of course we are. I mean, again, this is another human thing, right? We don't want to be uncomfortable, but we live in a time in which advertising is just always trying to promise there's going to be this next pleasant experience that's going to be so great. Just the next one's going to be really great. So this often is experienced as kind of like a leaning forward and I want more, give me more. That's the first hindrance. The second one is ill will or aversion. The flip side of wanting more is not wanting it at all. This turning away, I don't want this, get this away from me. Everything would be fine if only this weren't here. That kind of a habit or way to meet our experience. And to be sure, sometimes this leaning into or averting away from, these are natural human things and aren't necessarily a hindrance. Sometimes they can be wise and appropriate. But it's a hindrance when it starts to turn into, well, everything would just be fine if only this thing were here, and then I got to figure out how to do this, and I can't do that because of this, but maybe if I move this over here, then I can do that, and then, this kind of, I don't know, this busyness, this story making that surrounds the hindrances here. So a third one is sloth and torpor. It's kind of this fogginess, this lethargy, dullness, lack of brightness, lack of energy, lack of a certain vitality. It's also the fourth one, restlessness and remorse. This idea there's too much energy and this agitation, and either in the body, this feeling like it just can't sit still, fidgeting a lot, or where the mind can't settle down. It's like maybe going over and over and over something, rehearsing or remembering or just being agitated in general. That's the fourth. And the fifth is doubt, skeptical doubt. The type of doubt that kind of like you have this feeling like, well, okay, maybe I should do this. No, well, okay, no, actually I should do this. Well, maybe I shouldn't do that because I have to do this first, so then maybe I'll do this other thing. Sometimes shows up in our practice as, okay, I'm going to do mindfulness. Well, maybe I should do some loving kindness practice, kind of open up the heart a little bit. Well, okay, yeah, maybe mindfulness is better. Yeah, but that person said that concentration is good. Then I'm going to do concentration practice. So this kind of not really settling down. So tonight I'd like to talk a little bit about this relationship between the hindrances and joy, happiness, well-being, delight. We could say, obviously, like, okay, well, the hindrances are like the opposite of happiness, but I'd like us to look at this a little more closely. Maybe that's not necessarily the case, that it's the opposite. So there's, of course, a sense of well-being arises when we notice that a hindrance has ended. Often we don't notice. But it works the other way also, that cultivating a sense of well-being and a really broad definition of that word, that expression, can help us even while we're in the midst of hindrances, can help us kind of find more ease with the hindrances. And this isn't the usual way in which we kind of talk about the hindrances. Often we talk about, okay, if the hindrance is this, then you can do this specific thing. If there's sloth and torpor, tiredness, you can open your eyes, like is a typical example. But I'd like to look at this a little bit differently than the way that we often do. So as I was saying, that something that all these hindrances have in common, this sense of restriction. Either like there isn't the freedom to experience or be open to whatever is going to be next in experience. Instead, there's a sense of stuck and a sense of being mired in our experience. And so in those 5 little vignettes, often, well, not often, always, there's one vignette that's tied to a particular hindrance, but sometimes I think it's maybe we don't have to know exactly which one of those vignettes ties to exactly which hindrance, because it might be just all of them might feel like a prison, or all of them might feel like you're going across this desert with no support and you're so thirsty and there's no water for you, or something like this. So they all have this quality of this binding, this uncomfortableness. And maybe just for fun, I'll add a little bit with the commentaries, kind of add a little bit extra to these vignettes. And for example, it says, there is a person who has incurred a debt, but is unable to pay. Now, if their creditors, when telling the person to pay back the debt, speaks roughly and harasses and beats them, the person in debt is unable to retaliate, but has to bear it. Like, how many times have we seen this in the movies where, somebody does a deal with a loan shark and then the people come back and beat them up, and the person, they just have to run away. They can't stand up for themselves and say, no, stop it, you shouldn't be doing this. So there's a way in which there can feel like we're being pushed around. But the absence of the hindrances have this quality of release, this quality of freedom. And it may be really subtle. It doesn't mean it's not there. Doesn't mean it's not significant. And doesn't mean it can't support our practice. To notice this feeling of release or freedom from the hindrances. And the commentaries add, just as one who has freed themselves of debt no longer feels fear or anxiety when meeting their former creditors. So that's kind of the describing of the freedom, is no longer having anxiety, just this uncomfortable feeling when the creditors show up. So I talked about how the hindrances are part of just the human experience, but maybe even not only that if we're going to have a meditation practice, it's really a hindrance practice. Because the hindrances show up, unless you're in the jhanas all the time, you're in some absorptive concentration state from the moment you sit down until the moment you stand up, the hindrances are going to be there. So those work together, kind of like a meditation practice and working with the hindrances. And we can work with the hindrances by focusing on this part about the well-being, the ease, the joy, and the happiness. So to kind of like demonstrate this, I'll talk a little bit about the first hindrance. And I'm using the word first and second just because they're typically in a list. This might not be the first one that arises, of course. So oftentimes this craving for sensual pleasure, when it shows up in the context of our meditation practice, in the context of our life, we don't actually call it as craving for sense pleasure. Instead, we use this word, I need this thing. No, I really need it. And right, and these days, you just go Amazon.com, click, 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 and there you go, right? You can have like so many things, right? So there's this way, and there's kind of this reinforcement. Whatever you need, feel like you need, you can get if you have the means and you're so disposed to do that. This also kind of might fall into, I need to take care of myself this way. I deserve it, or whatever it might be. So, what is there a way in which we can work with this sense of I need this, and in our relationship with the sensual desires, one that's not supportive, that we feel it's kind of pushing us around a little bit? One, just recognize it's present. Just turn towards oh, yeah, all my thinking about what I'm going to fix for dinner is about sense desire. And sometimes it can be really helpful just to name it, and that can take a little bit of the momentum out from behind it. Sometimes just seeing it for what it is, recognizing it, maybe that can soften it. It's not always sufficient, though, to make it go away. And then next, to do some investigation and inquiry. How does it feel, really feel, to be having this experience of wanting, this experience of desire? And sometimes it can feel pleasant. Right in the beginning, there's this vitality that shows up, yeah, okay, I want this. But then, if we stick with this idea of feeling and investigating and feel into it, and we see that it's actually not a happy state. It's based on this idea of lack or insufficiency or inadequacy or uncomfortableness or something like that. And so it actually is uncomfortable. But often we don't stick around or really pay attention to it so that we notice the uncomfortableness. We just go from one desire, try to satisfy it, then the next one, try to satisfy it, next one, try to satisfy it, and our whole life ends up being this way, let alone our meditation periods. So it might be subtle, but often there is this contraction or closedness, or maybe this feeling of being in servitude or being in debt, not quite free, this kind of maybe oppressed feeling. And then when we recognize that, as best we can, not to have aversion towards that. And this isn't necessarily our first impulse, but can we then turn towards any okayness that's happening? Sometimes when there is some difficulty, in the previous instruction was to tune into or turn to the uncomfortableness, there's a way in which our awareness can kind of collapse around that's which uncomfortable. Another way to say this is that which is uncomfortable just looms so large and kind of consumes our awareness. But instead, can we maybe broaden our awareness? The uncomfortableness is still there, but notice, is there anything else that's okay, neutral, or even pleasant? And this often takes a little bit of energy to kind of open up from this collapsed kind of way in which we are with the difficulty, but to open up. Might be some neutral experiences in the body, feet on the ground, pressure of the cushion against the body. There might be a way in which we could pay attention to the breath and allow the breath to be really soothing, as comfortable as possible. Maybe there's a way we could just relax the body and notice, is there any tension in the shoulders? Maybe I can look at my posture and tuck my chin just a little bit, make some space at the back of my neck, and that often kind of brings a little bit more ease in the posture. So to orient towards something that's neutral or even okay or comfortable, both in the body and in the mind. Maybe one or the other might be more evident. And so this does a few things. One is it interrupts this momentum of wanting. This maybe doesn't make it go away, but it takes some of the momentum away from it. And it also reminds us that there's more than just this particular experience that we're having. There's a multitude of experiences. Because this hindrance in particular, but many of them, it can be like in the Buddhist tradition we have this story of the hungry ghosts, that these beings that are never satisfied, right? They have this big belly and really small throats. So that they just can never get enough nourishment. They can just never get enough. So in some ways it can feel like that. But if we are locked into this idea that some sense experience is really going to be satisfying, it's going to take care of that discomfort, then what we're actually doing is feeding the hungry ghost mindset. Like, oh, I need to get one more sense experience, one more sense experience, one more sense experience. And I'm encouraging us, is there a way in which we can look at something else that's not just another sense experience, that brings a little bit of okayness, maybe even a little delight or gladness? Relaxation in the body, letting the breath be pleasurable, the way that we breathe, tune into the rhythm of the breath. And then we could ask ourselves, what is really lacking in this moment? Like really? Sure, we don't have the double-decker chocolate thing, but this moment, this moment, not just the past one and not the next one, but this moment, what's really lacking? And to tune into that kind of also disrupts this idea of this hungry ghost that gets created that can't ever be satisfied. But instead, there's a little bit of contentment. And again, this might be really subtle. It doesn't mean it's not there. But the sense of, yeah, okay. I'm still breathing. This moment I'm still here. And whatever sense of okayness, neutral, is there. And so learning to have this kind of a wholesome kind of nourishment, pleasure, I'll say, is very powerful. This can be transformative. Not necessarily easy to train ourselves to look away from that is difficult because, right, this is what humans do. We have, it's like the difficulties are a magnet and we just attracts our attention and we can't let go of them and, I don't know, we just get a little bit obsessed with them. But if we can turn away a little bit, the hindrance, the difficulty is still there. We don't have to make it go away. We don't have to solve it. But just notice what else is there that's neutral and or even pleasant. And then we become kind of less infatuated with this idea that something out there is going to make everything better. And instead we're cultivating something that is enormously powerful, this idea that we can be with our experiences and be present in this moment. This allows us to be with something that's more fulfilling, more nourishing, has a depth to it. And to train ourselves to do this takes time. It's not something that we will do immediately, of course, but it's really worth the time and the effort. Because just like how the end of the hindrances have some well-being, joy and happiness, turning towards well-being helps to end the suffering. It goes both ways. But we don't have to wait for the hindrances to go away completely. We can open up to what else is there. And you may say, I don't know, Diana, this sounds kind of odd. Really, can we approach the hindrances with this? And I will say that there's lots of places in the suttas where the hindrances are kind of like partnered with the 7 factors of awakening. The hindrances are what hinders, gets in the way of freedom, awakening, wisdom, let alone, getting concentrated or seeing clearly or these types of things. So the hindrances, aptly named because they hinder that, 7 factors of awakening are the ones that support finding more freedom and ease, support seeing clearly, support concentration. And one of the 7 factors of awakening is joy. And there's also concentration in there. So there's this way in which cultivating this joy and happiness is part of the 7 factors of awakening, which is an antidote to the 5 hindrances. So that's kind of like a Buddhist list, technical idea about this idea, or we could use the Buddha's own teachings to support this idea. But I would just like to encourage that, to tune into, to recognize that when there's a difficulty and when it ends or subsides, most of them do, not all of them, right? We do have aging, this isn't going to end, and some of us have illnesses that probably aren't going to end, right? But notice that maybe when the severity lessens, or when there's difficulties, when they end, there's a little bit of delight. And use that as a reminder that we can cultivate delight, happiness, well-being, to help us with the difficulties. And one way to do that is to open up our experience and maybe loosen up the magnet, I think Rick Hansen famously says, right, that they're like Velcro. The difficulties are like Velcro. We kind of get stuck to them. So can we loosen up that Velcro a little bit and notice what else is here? So happiness and the hindrances. One way that we can work with these difficulties that arise in our life. So may you find plenty of opportunities to explore happiness and to experience it and allow it to be a support for you in whatever difficulties are arising for you. And may that support us to also support others, so that we can be part of what makes this world run more smoothly or with more care, with more warmth. So, thank you.